I used to believe that trust was the strongest foundation a marriage could have. I believed it so deeply that I built my entire life on it. 40 years of routines, quiet mornings, shared meals, and the gentle certainty that the man beside me would never harm me. I never imagined that love could hide shadows, or that silence could be the place where betrayal grows like mold in the dark. The day everything began to unravel, I remember feeling a strange heaviness in my chest, like my body knew before my mind did. It wasn't a dramatic discovery, not at first. It was a small letter, a phone call, a tone in someone's voice that didn't quite make sense. Life rarely breaks all at once. It fractures quietly until one day the cracks finally reach you. When the bank first contacted me, I thought it was a mistake. They asked about loans I had never heard of, documents with signatures that weren't mine, debts tied to my name. I remember staring at the papers, my hands trembling, my heartbeat loud in my ears. I kept saying one thing over and over. This is not mine. I said it like a prayer, like a desperate plea to the universe to return my life to the way it was 5 minutes before that moment. But life doesn't go backward, no matter how much we beg it to. The more I looked, the more I found. Locked drawers, redirected mail, accounts I never knew existed. It felt like walking barefoot through a house I thought I knew, only to discover hidden rooms filled with broken glass. Every shard was a truth I wasn't ready to face. Every discovery was another reminder that the man I trusted, the man I built decades with, had been living a secret life behind my back. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't even heartbroken. I was stunned, hollow, like someone had reached inside me and quietly rearranged the pieces without asking permission. That was the beginning, the moment the world shifted, and I realized nothing in my life was as solid as I believed. I didn't know how to explain the kind of silence that follows shock. It wasn't the quiet that calms you. It was the kind that presses against your chest, refusing to let you breathe. After everything fell apart, I remember sitting alone, staring at the walls that used to hear our laughter. And in that moment I felt smaller than I had ever been. Not because someone broke me, but because I trusted so deeply that I didn't see the storm coming. But that's the thing about life. Sometimes the people you'd burn your hands to keep warm are the same ones who watch you freeze. I kept replaying every moment in my mind, searching for signs, clues, anything that could explain why someone who once promised to protect my heart ended up crushing it instead. And yet, even through the pain, a part of me held on to something. Not hope, not anger, but a strange sense of awakening. Like my spirit was whispering, "This hurt is not the end. It's the beginning." For days I walked through my life like a shadow. The world kept moving, but I felt stuck in slow motion, trapped between what I lost and what I didn't know how to rebuild. People told me to move on, to forget, to just let it go, as if healing was as easy as flipping a switch. But healing isn't a straight path. It's a wild, uneven road that forces you to face the pieces of yourself you once ignored. And as painful as it was, I started to realize something powerful. I wasn't broken. I was transforming. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It wasn't some grand moment where light poured through the clouds and everything suddenly made sense. It was slower, quieter, almost invisible. It began with tiny choices. Choosing to get out of bed when my heart wanted to stay hidden. Choosing to breathe through the ache instead of drowning in it. Choosing to face the truth instead of running from it. Every small decision became a thread, weaving me back into myself. There were days when the anger felt heavier than the sadness. Days when I wanted to shout, to demand answers, to ask why someone could walk away so easily after leaving a storm inside me. But even in those moments, I realized that chasing explanations would only keep me chained to the past. Sometimes closure isn't something someone gives you. Sometimes closure is something you create within yourself. And slowly, I began to see parts of my life that I had ignored. Things I tolerated. Red flags I painted white. People I kept close simply because the thought of losing them felt worse than the reality of how they treated me. It hurt, more than I expected, to admit that I had abandoned myself long before anyone else did. But that truth became a turning point. Because once you see your own worth, even just a glimpse, you can't unsee it. I started reclaiming pieces of my identity, my voice, my strength, my dreams, the things that had been pushed aside to keep someone else comfortable. And with each step back into myself, I felt a shift. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Like the slow rise of dawn after a long, cold night. I wasn't fully healed, but I was finally facing the right direction. The support group became a sanctuary. The first few meetings, I worried that no one would come, that I'd be speaking into an empty room, that my story wouldn't matter. But they came, women with tired eyes, hesitant voices, holding secrets too heavy to carry alone. And when they spoke, it was as if the room breathed collectively, every word a release, every tear a shared understanding. Their pain mirrored mine in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not in exact details, not in the same names or numbers, but in the patterns, the control, the isolation, the quiet erosion of identity under the guise of love. Listening to them, I realized that the struggle wasn't just mine. It had a face, a history, a quiet ubiquity that no one talked about. I became both witness and participant, learning the subtle signs, hearing the whispered doubts, feeling the tremors of fear behind polite smiles. And I saw something miraculous. Even in the midst of betrayal, even when trust had been weaponized against them, they were choosing to show up, to speak, to reclaim a fragment of themselves. The stories were raw, visceral, and sometimes unbearable. One woman recounted discovering her life savings had vanished overnight. Another spoke of loans taken in her name that she would be paying off for decades. Yet in that room there was courage. There was solidarity. And in witnessing it, I began to understand the true power of vulnerability. The kind that doesn't ask for sympathy but demands recognition. By acknowledging the hidden violence we had endured, we were creating a space where survival could evolve into transformation. And in that evolution, I saw my own reflection, stronger, clearer, and quietly unbreakable. As the months passed, the group grew. We moved from the cramped backroom of the school to a community center in Germantown, a space large enough to hold the swelling circle of women who refused to remain invisible. Each meeting, I watched strangers transform into allies, into witnesses, into a living testament of resilience. Names became familiar, faces etched into memory, stories weaving together into a tapestry of shared struggle and quiet triumph. I noticed the small victories first. The woman who had been too terrified to ask about her husband's spending now brought spreadsheets, questions, and statements. Another, who had avoided the mail for years, started opening envelopes, reclaiming her sense of agency one letter at a time. And I saw the subtle change in myself too. Where once I had carried fear and shame in equal measure, I now felt a cautious pride, tempered by empathy and the knowledge that even in the face of betrayal, the human spirit could endure, and even flourish. Miss Ida May often stayed after meetings, helping organize chairs, brewing coffee, listening to the quieter stories that never made it to the circle. One evening, as we stacked chairs and wiped down tables, she said softly, "You know what you're doing here, right? This isn't just a support group. You're building a legacy. You are taking what was meant to destroy you and turning it into something that heals." I paused, letting her words sink in. Transformation. That word had begun to feel heavy with meaning. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was creation, a deliberate act of reclaiming life from the ruins, a conscious refusal to let pain define the shape of the rest of my days. I began to understand that the life I thought I had lost was not just about Thaddeus, not just about the marriage or the money or even the house. It was about trust shattered, about the quiet erosion of self over decades, about the invisible chains no one else could see. Yet, in the circle of those women, in the small victories and shared tears, I realized something profound. Each of us was rewriting our own stories. We were no longer defined by the betrayals, the losses, or the fear. We were defined by our courage to confront them, to speak them aloud, and to keep moving forward when every instinct screamed to retreat. 1 year after Thaddeus's death, we marked the anniversary of our support group. 28 women circled the room that evening, each carrying scars, each carrying hope. Some I knew intimately. Others were strangers whose presence spoke volumes about the quiet reach of shared pain. When I spoke that night, I recounted the battles, the legal fights, the stolen identities, the sleepless nights, the betrayal, and the painstaking reconstruction of my life. And then I watched as silence gave way to courage. One by one, they shared their stories, the lies, the manipulations, the isolation, the slow awakening. Each narrative was different in detail but identical in pattern. Control, deception, fear, but also strength, resistance, survival. I told them honestly, I didn't stay strong every moment. I cried, I screamed, I raged. I felt paralyzed at times. But I didn't give up, because giving up would have been letting the past dictate the rest of my life. I chose to move forward. And you can too. In that room under the dim fluorescent lights, I felt a subtle shift. Not just in them but in me. That night, I knew that rebuilding wasn't a solo act. It was communal. It was a shared reclamation of power, of agency, of self. The following months brought a steady rhythm to my life. A rhythm punctuated by meetings, phone calls, and quiet moments of reflection. Each woman who walked into our circle carried her own story, her own fear, her own trembling heart, yet all shared a singular truth. Betrayal leaves invisible scars. Some were timid at first, whispering, unsure of whether their pain was valid, whether anyone would understand. But as the sessions continued, as stories were shared and tears flowed, strength emerged. I watched women who had felt powerless reclaim authority over their finances, their choices, their lives. I watched them slowly, deliberately, turn whispers of despair into declarations of independence. And in the process, I too found healing. Every smile, every tear, every hand held in solidarity reminded me that I was no longer alone. Langston helped too, quietly behind the scenes, making sure that Zadie's life, our life, was protected from any lingering shadows of Thaddeus's deceit. We created systems, safeguards, boundaries. Credit reports were restored, accounts were secured, the past examined and cataloged, so that no surprises could emerge to destabilize our newfound freedom. And yet, it was more than just practicalities. It was reclaiming dignity, the sense that we were entitled to know, to ask, to challenge, to protect ourselves. One evening, after a particularly intense session, Miss Ida May and I stayed behind, tidying the chairs and wiping down tables. The room smelled faintly of coffee and worn books, of lives being rewritten. She looked at me, her eyes calm but intense. "Ulleia," she said softly, "you are doing something far greater than you realize. You are transforming lives. You are transforming pain into purpose. This is a legacy." Her words lingered, heavy yet luminous, like a candle burning steadily in a dark room. I realized then that my journey was no longer just about surviving Thaddeus. It was about creating light in places where darkness had once reigned. The word transformation began to settle in me like a seed taking root. For so long I had measured my life by the ruins Thaddeus left behind, the forged signatures, the stolen money, the broken trust. I had counted loss after loss, tallying everything he had taken, everything I had mourned. But now, as I looked around at the circle of women whose lives were slowly stitching themselves back together, I realized that the measure of life could also be what we built after destruction. Every story shared in that room was a brick in a new foundation. A foundation built not on fear, not on deception, but on truth, resilience, and solidarity. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit by the window of my apartment, the city lights flickering like distant stars, and think about how fragile our lives can feel when trust is broken. How easily someone we love can wield power over our finances, our security, our sense of self. And yet, in that same fragility there was power, the power to rise, to question, to reclaim, to teach. I remembered the young woman who had walked in one evening trembling, saying she felt her husband's control tightening around her life. I remembered the fear in her voice, the uncertainty in her eyes. I remembered holding her hands, feeling her pulse and whispering, "Trust that feeling. Ask questions. Insist on answers. Protect yourself." That moment crystallized everything I had learned. The courage to face reality, however painful, was itself transformative. By the time our group's first anniversary rolled around, the back room at the school was packed beyond capacity. 28 women sat in a circle, each with her own story, each with her own wounds, each with her own spark of renewed hope. Some cried silently, some nodded in understanding, and some spoke boldly, recounting the ways they had taken back control of their lives. And I too spoke about Thaddeus, about betrayal, about loss, about the hours spent wondering if I would ever breathe freely again. And yet, as I spoke, I realized I was no longer speaking from despair. I was speaking from survival, from reclamation, from the slow, steady, painful, and beautiful process of becoming someone new. That night, after the anniversary meeting, the last woman had left, and Miss Ida May and I were stacking chairs, wiping crumbs from the tables, the quiet of the empty room settling around us like a soft blanket. "You know what you're doing here, right?" she said, her voice gentle but steady, full of conviction. I paused, hands on the chair, and looked at her. "I think so," I said slowly, unsure if words could capture it. "I'm helping women," I continued. "But I don't know if I'm changing anything in the world." Miss Ida shook her head, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. "Ulleia, you're not just helping women. You're building a legacy. You're taking something that tried to destroy you and transforming it into power, into hope, into a roadmap for anyone who's ever been silenced, betrayed, or left helpless." Her words landed inside me like a weight I didn't know I was carrying had finally been lifted. I realized she was right. Every document I had fought over, every sleepless night, every tear, every scream, every quiet whisper to myself in the dark, it had all been leading to this moment. This quiet revolution of women reclaiming their voices, their finances, their dignity. The door to the school closed behind us, the streetlights casting long golden shadows across the sidewalk. I inhaled deeply, tasting the crisp night air, the faint scent of spring, and I felt the heaviness of grief and anger starting to dissipate. I thought of Thaddeus, of the man I had loved and trusted for decades, and a strange clarity came over me. I could honor the grief without letting it define me. I could acknowledge the betrayal without letting it dictate my future. And I could teach others, show others, guide others that they could do the same. Transformation, I realized, wasn't just about survival. It was about choosing to rise above the pain, choosing to turn the darkest moments into fuel for change. The following weeks, the support group became a heartbeat in my life. Every Tuesday evening, women filled the room with stories that were both painful and strangely beautiful. Each tale echoed my own: husbands hiding statements, forging signatures, emptying accounts, making their wives feel insane for even asking questions. I listened, sometimes taking notes, sometimes just holding their hands, letting them know they were not alone. Their tears became my tears. Their quiet relief became my own. And slowly we began to build something that went beyond recovery. A sisterhood, a network, a safety net for those who had nowhere else to turn. One evening, a woman arrived clutching a worn folder. She hesitated at the doorway, and I gestured for her to come in. "I think my husband is hiding money from me," she whispered. Her voice trembled, her eyes wide with fear. I led her to a chair, offered a warm cup of tea, and just listened. Piece by piece, she revealed the cracks in her marriage, the subtle manipulations, the silent erosion of trust. And when she finished, I said gently, "You are not imagining this. What you feel is real. And you have the right to know, the right to protect yourself, the right to reclaim your life." Her shoulders relaxed just slightly, and I saw a flicker of hope ignite in her eyes. That moment crystallized for me why this work mattered. It wasn't about me. It wasn't even about the paperwork, the legal battles, the long nights spent sorting through Thaddeus's forgeries. It was about giving others the courage to see the truth, to confront it, and to move forward. We started sharing practical tools too. Websites to track finances, apps to manage accounts safely, tips for documenting transactions, names of honest attorneys who wouldn't exploit their clients' fear. Slowly, knowledge became empowerment. Women who had felt trapped began to smile again, began to feel in control. And I realized my own journey, the hours spent agonizing over statements, the months of sleepless worry, had forged me into someone who could guide others, someone who could turn personal catastrophe into collective strength. The months rolled on, and the support group grew like a quiet fire. From the first dozen women, we swelled to more than 30, then 40, each person carrying her own story, each story a thread in a larger tapestry of pain, resilience, and awakening. Sometimes I would watch them arrive, hesitant steps, downcast eyes, the weight of fear pressing them down. And I remembered myself walking into that room the first time, unsure if anyone would believe me, unsure if I could even believe myself. Now, seeing them settle in, seeing them unburden their hearts, I felt a sense of purpose that was deeper than I had ever known. It wasn't just recovery anymore. It was transformation. One night, after the meeting, Miss Ida May and I stayed behind to clear the room. The chairs stacked neatly, the last of the cookies eaten, the air still scented faintly with coffee. She looked at me with a softness that made me pause. "Do you understand what you've created here?" she asked. I shook my head, unsure. "You're not just running a support group, Ulleia. You're changing lives. You're turning pain into power. You're giving women a way to see themselves again, to find their voices, to take back control." I swallowed hard, feeling a lump in my throat. The magnitude of it all hit me in that quiet moment. How from the ashes of betrayal and loss, something meaningful, something beautiful, something life-affirming had risen. It was exhausting work, emotionally, mentally, physically. Some days I would go home completely drained, my heart heavy with the stories I had heard, my mind replaying the injustices, the betrayals. Yet, when I would wake the next morning, I felt a quiet determination. I could not stop. I would not stop. Each story reminded me of my own journey, of what Thaddeus had tried to steal, of what I had fought to reclaim. And in guiding others, I reclaimed pieces of myself I didn't even realize I had lost. Courage, clarity, compassion, and the quiet but unshakable knowledge that I could survive anything. The stories continued to pour in, each one hitting me like a wave, pulling me under and forcing me to surface again, gasping stronger each time. There was a woman named Marlene, mid-40s, eyes rimmed red, hands trembling. Her husband had emptied their savings, claiming it was for the family, but she discovered the money was gone, invested in schemes she had never agreed to. She came in clutching bank statements, her voice shaking, whispering, "I feel so stupid for trusting him." I reached across the circle, took her hands in mine and said firmly, "You are not stupid. You are not alone. This is not your fault." She sobbed into her palms, the sound raw and unfiltered, the kind of cry that shakes the room. It struck me then as I held her, that the weight these women carried was not just financial. It was a betrayal of self, a theft of agency, a silent erosion of confidence that left them doubting their every thought. And I understood something profound. The truth of their fear, the deep, gnawing anxiety that accompanies the realization that someone you loved and trusted could systematically dismantle your life, bit by bit. My own past, Thaddeus's deception, and Zaid's disbelief had carved scars, yes, but here in this circle of women, I saw those scars reflected, shared, acknowledged. The pain was mutual, but so was the courage. By the third month, our little backroom could no longer contain the growing circle. We moved to a community center in Germantown, a bright space with high ceilings, sunlight streaming through tall windows, a place where the echoes of laughter and tears could coexist without crowding each other. Each woman who entered carried a story, a secret, a fear, but also a glimmer of hope. And in those meetings I began to see that hope ignite into something tangible. A collective strength that neither deception nor betrayal could erase. The meetings became a lifeline not just for the women but for me too. I started to notice the subtle shifts in their posture, the way their voices gained confidence, the small smiles that broke through tears. Each week someone would share a victory, a bank account restored, a credit score corrected, a confrontation faced without fear. And each time I felt a rush of something I hadn't felt in months. Purpose. The kind of purpose that comes not from holding power over others, but from lifting them up when the world has tried to crush them. One evening, after the meeting had ended and the last chairs were stacked neatly against the wall, Miss Ida May came over. She had that look in her eyes, the one that said she understood more than words could capture. "Ulleia, do you know what you're doing here?" she asked softly. I shook my head, unsure of what she meant. "You're not just helping women survive. You're transforming lives. You're turning trauma into action. You're showing yourself, that the person who tried to erase you cannot define you." Her words sank deep, and I realized she was right. Every conversation, every tear shed, every piece of advice given, was a brick in the foundation of something greater than survival. It was the beginning of transformation. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I started to see it in myself. The fear that had gnawed at me since discovering Thaddeus's lies began to recede. I still carried the scars, but the weight was lighter now, shared among a circle of women who understood, who had endured similar pain, and who were learning, like me, that strength can grow from betrayal, resilience can flourish from loss. One night, after a particularly emotional meeting, I walked home alone under the dim glow of the streetlights. The city was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of autumn leaves. I thought about Zadie, about Langston, about the women who had shared their stories trembling and raw in the circle. And I realized that for the first time in years, I was beginning to feel a sense of peace, fragile, yes, but unmistakably real. The truth was, transformation wasn't a sudden, cinematic moment. It wasn't a single act of defiance or a courtroom victory. It was countless tiny decisions. Choosing to face the truth instead of hiding from it. Choosing to speak instead of remaining silent. Choosing to trust in myself when the world had tried to convince me I couldn't. Every document filed, every phone call to a credit bureau, every word of support I offered another woman was part of that slow, painstaking reconstruction of my life. The following weeks brought more stories, more faces, more hearts broken and mending. One woman, barely able to speak, told me how she had discovered her husband had secretly taken out loans in her name. She was terrified, ashamed, but she came. And as I listened, I held her hands and said the same words I had whispered to myself countless times. "You are not alone. What has been taken from you can be reclaimed. You are stronger than you think." And as she cried, and as other women nodded in quiet solidarity, I understood something vital. Pain, isolation, betrayal, these were not signs of weakness. They were the soil in which courage could grow. And in nurturing that courage, in guiding it to bloom, I was finding my own way out of the darkness Thaddeus had left behind. The months rolled on, each one bringing new challenges and new victories, small but meaningful. Zadie's credit was slowly being repaired. Langston had created a secure future for his children, and the support group I had started was no longer just a small gathering in the back of the school. It had grown into a thriving circle of women, all of us bound together by shared pain, shared lessons, and the fragile, powerful hope that comes from knowing you are no longer alone. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings, I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, and thought about everything Thaddeus had taken from me. My trust, my sense of security, my illusions about our marriage. But then I thought about everything I had gained back in different ways: my autonomy, my clarity, my voice, and most importantly, my purpose. I was no longer defined by the betrayal I had endured. I was defined by how I chose to rise from it. Sometimes the nights were the hardest, quiet, empty, and echoing with memories. But I learned to breathe through the weight of it. I learned that it was okay to feel the pain, to let the tears fall, to let the anger simmer. Because every tear, every pang of loss was part of the process. And slowly, imperceptibly, the fear and the despair began to lose their grip. I remembered the woman who had come to me months ago, terrified, suspicious, exhausted by her own husband's control. She returned one evening, her eyes bright, her voice steady. She had filed for divorce, had discovered the hidden accounts, had taken the first steps to reclaim her life. And in that moment I realized something profound. The real victory wasn't in winning the court case. It wasn't in the reversal of fraudulent loans. The victory was in empowering others to find their own strength, to confront their own truths, to reclaim what was theirs. The support group became my second home. Every Tuesday evening, women arrived carrying invisible burdens, stories too heavy to carry alone. They sat in the circle, hands trembling, eyes red from crying, hearts raw with experiences they had hidden for years. And each time I listened, really listened, not as a judge, not as a counselor, but as someone who had walked the same treacherous path. I felt their fear, their shame, their uncertainty, and I told them honestly, it is terrifying. It is exhausting. It is lonely at times. But you are not powerless. You are not invisible. You are not alone. One night, after a long session filled with tears and confessions, a woman stayed behind. She lingered in the doorway, twisting the strap of her bag, unsure how to leave or what to say. I walked over and offered her a cup of tea. She looked at me, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I can face this. I've been in the dark for so long, and now I'm terrified of what I'll find. I took her hands, felt the tremor of her fear. You don't have to face it all at once. Start with one piece, one bill, one statement. Knowledge is power, and every step forward is a victory. As she left, I realized the ripple effect of what we were building. Each woman who reclaimed her finances, who asked questions, who confronted her fears, would in turn strengthen another. This network of survivors was quietly forming, growing in strength and courage. I thought about Zadie, now more confident and assertive with her own finances, more grounded in her identity. I thought about Langston, steadfast and patient, helping us navigate the chaos without judgment. And I thought about myself, learning that strength wasn't just in endurance, it was in empathy, in action, in transforming pain into purpose. Months passed, and the support group grew beyond anything I had imagined. Women came from neighborhoods I hadn't known existed, some riding the bus for over an hour just to sit in that circle, just to speak, just to be heard. Their stories were heartbreaking, shocking yet familiar. Husbands hiding statements, forging signatures, controlling every aspect of money. And yet, with each story, I noticed something remarkable. These women were not just victims, they were survivors. The first timid, hesitant steps toward reclaiming their lives turned into bold strides. They asked questions, demanded documents, contacted lawyers, and some even faced their abusers directly for the first time in years. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Ms. Ida May and I lingered, stacking chairs, cleaning crumbs from cookies, sipping tea that had gone cold long ago. She turned to me, her eyes reflecting both admiration and a quiet awe. Do you see what you've done here? This isn't just a group. You're creating a sanctuary. You're giving these women their power back. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I felt the weight of everything that had been stolen from me. The years of trust, the identity, the peace. And yet, in helping others reclaim theirs, I felt a sense of liberation I hadn't thought possible. Zadie came to me later that week, holding her laptop tightly. "Mama, look at this," she said. She had started documenting stories from the group online anonymously with consent. Women shared their experiences, their strategies, their small victories. The website grew steadily, connecting women who could never attend the meetings in person. And in those stories I saw echoes of my own journey. The fear, the betrayal, the sleepless nights. But also the courage, the defiance, the determination to reclaim life from the ashes of deceit. It struck me that what Thaddeus tried to destroy had not just survived, it had multiplied. The days grew longer, yet strangely lighter. I began to notice subtle changes in myself, ones I hadn't expected. Where I once flinched at the mention of money, I now approached it with a cautious curiosity, a quiet confidence that had been absent for decades. I opened my own accounts, learned to track every transaction, every statement, every bill. The financial world that had once been an alien, terrifying place became a landscape I could navigate, slowly, carefully, and purposefully. Each small victory, a correctly filed form, a balanced statement, a successfully disputed charge, was a brick laid in the foundation of my new independence. Zadie became my partner in this journey. Nights were spent reviewing statements together, discussing strategies, laughing over minor confusions, sometimes crying over the absurdity of what we had endured. She marveled at my resilience, but I reminded her gently. It wasn't resilience alone. It was necessity. It was survival. It was a refusal to allow someone else's deception to dictate the rest of my life. And she began to take courage for herself, challenging the lingering doubts planted by her father's lies, demanding transparency in her own life, insisting on accountability in her relationships. The support group continued to flourish. We expanded to 2 sessions a month, then 3, accommodating newcomers, repeat visitors, and women who just needed the reassurance of a listening ear. The room often buzzed with emotion, anger, grief, fear, and hope all tangled together. But amidst the chaos there was a rhythm, a heartbeat that spoke louder than any betrayal ever could: solidarity. The women leaned on each other, shared strategies, offered empathy without judgment. And for the first time in years I felt a profound sense of purpose. My story, my suffering, my survival had become a tool, not just for healing myself, but for guiding others through the same storm. One afternoon, a woman named Claire came to the group. She was quiet at first, eyes fixed on the floor, hands gripping her purse like a lifeline. Something about her posture, the tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided eye contact, struck me deeply. She reminded me of myself months earlier. Overwhelmed, isolated, unsure where to turn, afraid to trust even her own instincts. I invited her to sit, to share as much or as little as she wanted. Her voice trembled as she began, and then it broke completely. Her husband had meticulously managed every penny, convinced her that she couldn't understand finances. She had started noticing small discrepancies, withdrawals she didn't authorize, bills unpaid, investments she didn't know about, but every time she asked, he gaslight her, saying she was imagining things. By the time she realized the truth, significant damage had already been done. Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I held her hands and whispered what I had learned to repeat like a mantra. You are not crazy. You are not imagining it. Trust yourself. Her story mirrored so many others: control, isolation, manipulation, the slow erosion of trust. But there was a subtle difference in the way she held herself at the end of the session, a glimmer of possibility that had not been there when she arrived. Weeks later, she returned with documents, evidence, and a plan. She was ready to reclaim her life step by step. Watching her transformation, I realized the true power of the group wasn't just in sharing stories. It was in witnessing courage awaken in each other, in knowing that no one had to face betrayal alone, and that the smallest act of claiming your truth can become the spark that ignites a life rebuilt. The months rolled on and the support group became more than just a circle of chairs and coffee. It became a sanctuary, a place where silence could be shattered and truth could breathe. Each woman who walked through the door carried a story that could have stayed buried forever. Yet here they were, brave enough to let it out, to be seen, to be believed. There was laughter too, a fragile but genuine kind, punctuating the grief, the horror, the disbelief. It was as if reclaiming your voice automatically reclaimed part of your soul. I watched new bonds form, friendships that were forged in the heat of shared pain. We celebrated small victories together. The first cleared debt, the first legal victory, the first night of sleep without fear. And yet, the shadows of betrayal lingered. I saw them in the hesitant glances, in the fear that their partners could still manipulate, still hide, still control. It reminded me that recovery isn't linear. It is jagged, it is messy, and it is profoundly human. One evening after a particularly emotional meeting, I walked home under the streetlights, reflecting on everything that had happened. The house that Thaddeus had almost stolen from me was still mine. The credit and finances were slowly restored. Zadie was healing. Langston had become my steadfast anchor. And yet, what truly mattered wasn't the house or the money. It was the reclamation of dignity, the reclaiming of self. That realization hit me like a wave. All the losses I had endured were now transformed into lessons, into empathy, into purpose. I had been broken, yes, but in those cracks light entered, and I was no longer just surviving. I was living fully, painfully, beautifully alive. The support group grew slowly but steadily, like a garden finally seeing sunlight after years of neglect. Women came from neighborhoods I had never visited, from lives I could barely imagine. Yet the stories were the same. Control, secrecy, manipulation, betrayal hidden behind the familiar smiles of someone they loved. I realized that what Thaddeus had done to me was not unique, not a rare tragedy, but a pattern repeated in countless households, often unseen, unspoken. And in that moment I understood the magnitude of what we were doing. This was not just healing, it was revolution. Each meeting became a ceremony of survival. We shared stories, yes, but also strategies. How to protect finances, how to approach family, how to reclaim credit. And sometimes we simply sat in silence, holding space for one another, because words were insufficient for the weight we carried. I saw tears transform into smiles, despair turn into determination, and fear blossom into courage. I saw women walk in hunched over, small and fragile, and leave standing taller than I had ever seen them. And I thought of myself, how I had arrived at this point. Broken, betrayed, nearly erased, yet somehow here I was, a witness to resilience, a participant in transformation, and yes, a survivor. I often caught myself reflecting on Zadie, the daughter who had doubted, who had been shielded from the truth, who had needed me to be strong even when I felt empty. Watching her regain her credit, her trust, her confidence, it reminded me that recovery is not just about oneself. It ripples outward, touching others, creating bonds stronger than the deceit that once threatened to destroy us. And in the quiet moments when the world felt still, I felt a deep, almost sacred sense of purpose. That what Thaddeus tried to take from me, the control, the dignity, the life itself, had not succeeded, could not succeed. I had rebuilt brick by brick, breath by breath, and now I was teaching others to do the same. Months passed, and with each meeting the group's energy shifted. It was no longer just about recounting pain. It became about reclaiming power, redefining what it meant to live beyond betrayal. The stories, once whispered and tentative, now echoed with confidence. Women no longer asked if they were imagining it. They knew. They saw the patterns. They recognized the manipulation for what it was and, importantly, began to act. I watched as timid voices hardened into firm statements, as uncertainty transformed into decisive action. There was an unspoken magic in that space. A realization that silence was optional, that courage was contagious, and that together we could dismantle the weight that had pressed on us for decades. I also began to see the personal changes within myself. The anger, though still present at times, no longer defined me. It was a tool, a signal, not a prison. I slept better, my mind clearer, my heart more open. I laughed with genuine joy, not the cautious laughter of someone perpetually on alert. And slowly, the life Thaddeus had tried to erase, the small pleasures, the quiet victories, the sense of self returned. I took long walks in the mornings, sat in cafes with a book and coffee just for me. And I began dreaming again, allowing myself to imagine a future unshaped by fear or deceit. But even with this progress, there were reminders, documents I had to review, credit disputes to resolve, the ongoing maintenance of what had been so carelessly dismantled. And still, in these moments, I felt something I hadn't in decades: control. Not control over others, but over my own life, my own choices, my own destiny. The difference was profound. And every time a woman in the group reported a small victory, restored credit, a confrontation with a dishonest spouse, a newfound sense of freedom, it felt like my victory too, a validation that every tear, every sleepless night, every anxious day had not been in vain. One evening, after a particularly long meeting, I stayed behind with Miss Ida May. The chairs still arranged in the circle, empty cups and crumbs scattered across the table. "Ulleia," she said quietly, her voice carrying that gentle weight it always had. "Do you see what you've built here? This isn't just a support group anymore. It's a movement, a lifeline. You've created a space where women can find themselves again." I smiled, but it was tinged with fatigue. The weight of the past, the grief, the betrayal, it lingered like a shadow that refused to leave completely. Yet there was light too, a resilience I hadn't recognized in myself until now. "I didn't plan for this," I admitted. "I just needed to survive. I needed someone to believe me, and when no one did, I realized I had to be that someone. For myself, for my daughter, for every woman who's been silenced." Miss Ida nodded. "And in doing that, you've become more than a survivor. You've become a guide, a beacon." Her words settled into my chest, warming a place that had grown cold with years of betrayal. I realized she was right. I wasn't just navigating my own pain anymore. I was carrying the collective pain, the collective hope, the collective will of women who had been stripped of trust and security. And somehow, in that shared journey, we were rebuilding not just individual lives but a community. Later that night, as I closed the door of my modest apartment, the city humming softly beyond the windows, I felt the quiet thrill of possibility. I sat at the kitchen table, folder of newly collected documents beside me, and thought about Zadie, about the young woman who had come seeking guidance, about the women whose stories were still waiting to be heard. Each one carried a spark, fragile yet fierce. And I knew then, as I had known in fragments before, that what had been taken from me, my sense of safety, my financial freedom, my trust, could never be taken again. Not because others wouldn't try, but because I had learned how to guard it, nurture it, and rebuild it. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act. Teaching at the language school, managing the support group, keeping my own affairs in order, and nurturing Zadie's healing. She was recovering slowly but steadily. I watched her face regain its brightness, her laughter return in small, unexpected moments, and I was reminded that recovery was not linear. It was a series of starts and stops, setbacks and small victories, like stepping stones across a river that sometimes surged unpredictably. One afternoon, a new woman came to the group, trembling as she sat down in the circle. She clutched a folder close to her chest as if it were a shield. I think I'm being manipulated," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Her story was familiar, the husband controlling every financial move, isolating her from accounts, insisting she wasn't capable of understanding money. My heart tightened. I remembered every sleepless night, every moment of disbelief, every time Thaddeus had hidden reality behind his charm and reason. I leaned forward, speaking softly but firmly. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Your instincts are your first line of defense. Look at the documents, ask questions, verify everything. Don't wait for permission or validation from someone who thrives on control. Your awareness is your armor. She nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. I reached out, held her hands, and felt the tremor of relief and fear vibrating between us. This was why I was here. This was why I had endured the humiliation, the betrayal, the slow destruction of my sense of safety. Because if I could help one woman reclaim her life, then every tear I had shed, every sleepless night, every anxious moment had a purpose beyond my own survival. Later that evening, as I walked home under the muted glow of streetlights, the city quiet and patient, I realized something profound. My story was no longer just mine. It belonged to every woman who had felt invisible, powerless, silenced. And in giving it voice, in offering guidance and hope, I had transformed the ache of betrayal into a force that could illuminate paths, build courage, and protect futures. The support group had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. From 12 women in that tiny back room, we had expanded to over 30, each carrying a story that mirrored pain I once thought uniquely mine. We had outgrown the school, the walls too small to contain our shared grief and courage. Now we met at a community center in Germantown, a space bright with light and possibility, where we could spread chairs in a circle large enough for everyone, pour coffee, and lay out cookies without worrying about space. During one of these sessions, a woman spoke with quiet determination that belied her trembling hands. I found out my husband has been taking money from our joint accounts for years, she said, her voice cracking. I feel like my life has been a lie. I reached across the circle, taking her hands in mine. You're not alone, I said. It's not your fault. And you can take it back one step at a time. I saw nods around the circle, faces reflecting recognition, empathy, the silent acknowledgement of shared trauma. I realized then that the group had become more than a support circle, it was a lifeline. Women who once hid in shame now spoke freely, strategized together, offered resources, and reminded one another that survival was not only possible, but achievable. Lawyers, financial advisors, and credit counselors became part of our shared network. We exchanged practical knowledge, how to freeze accounts, track spending, detect fraudulent activity. But we also exchanged courage, a commodity far more valuable. That night, as I returned home, I held Zadie close and reflected on the irony. The life I had lost to betrayal had transformed into a mission that saved lives. My pain had become a map for others navigating their own darkness. And I understood finally that this was my purpose, not merely to rebuild what Thaddeus had destroyed, but to ensure that no other woman felt powerless in silence, no other daughter faced a world where lies masqueraded as love. The revolution of transparency and courage had begun in a quiet room with 12 chairs, and it was unstoppable. Months passed, and the rhythm of our support group became a heartbeat in my life. Each meeting carried stories that gnawed at the soul, but also stories of triumph, however small. A woman named Clara shared how she had confronted her husband after discovering secret credit cards in her name. Her hands shook as she recounted it, but the relief in her voice was palpable. She was reclaiming herself piece by piece. Watching her, I remembered my own disbelief when I first discovered Thaddeus's forgeries. The shock, the nausea, the fear. Each woman's journey echoed mine in 1,000 variations, and yet the outcomes were starting to differ. I began to notice subtle shifts in the women who returned week after week. Shoulders that had been weighed down with fear straightened. Eyes that had avoided confrontation now held a glimmer of determination. They learned to ask questions, to insist on transparency, to reclaim control of their lives. The lessons I had painfully learned in court, in the long nights unraveling Thaddeus's deception, were now being passed on without bitterness, without rancor, only with truth and the quiet power of experience. Zadie's progress was equally remarkable. Slowly, with each disputed account corrected, each fraudulent card canceled, her confidence returned. She began making her own financial decisions, discussing them with me, no longer hiding behind fear or disbelief. Langston, too, invested patiently, protecting the family's future, quietly ensuring that what had happened to us could never happen to our children. Together, we were weaving a network of protection, resilience, and wisdom, a fortress built from the rubble of betrayal. One evening, after a particularly intense meeting, Miss Ida May turned to me, her eyes soft but piercing. "You're building more than a group, Ulleia," she said. "You're creating a legacy of empowerment. Every woman who walks through that door leaves with more than advice. They leave with courage. That courage will ripple through generations." I nodded, swallowing a lump in my throat. I finally understood. What had been stolen from me, the sense of security, trust, and peace, was being reborn, multiplied in the lives of countless women. I walked out of the bank that day, the spring air brushing against my face, sun warming my shoulders, and for the first time in over a year I felt whole. Not the woman I was before Thaddeus, not the wife who had trusted blindly, but someone new, stronger, clearer, unbroken. Every step I took felt like a reclaiming of my own life. Every breath a reminder that I was still here, still breathing, still choosing me. I thought of the women in our support group, the faces that mirrored my own fear, my own confusion, my own hope. I thought of Zadie, her hands trembling yet holding documents that proved her freedom. I thought of Langston, quiet strength at my side, unwavering in belief and care. And I understood deeply that the story of betrayal was never just mine. It was a call, a mirror, a warning, and also a guide. If you are listening to this story, if there's a secret fear gnawing at you, if you feel trapped by someone you love, I want you to hear me clearly. Trust that feeling. Ask the questions. Open the letters. Look at the statements. Protect yourself. Love is not silence, love is not control, love is not fear. True love is partnership, respect, transparency. And if your world crumbles, if the person you thought you knew turns out to be someone else entirely, know this: you are stronger than you think. You can rebuild. You can rise. You can reclaim your name, your life, your future. I survived betrayal. I rebuilt from ashes. And so can you. Stand, breathe, speak your truth. Protect yourself. Love yourself fiercely. And remember, no one has the right to keep you in the dark about your own life. You are your own light. You are your own power. You are unbreakable.